Sometimes I go out of my way to try and make a really interesting point that kind of cuts against the grain and is just like really impressive. Like, wow, Zealand, you've put a lot of thought into this. Now I'm now seeing something from your perspective. Or, wow, Zealand, you're an idiot. Why don't you agree with me? Right? But at least we're trying. We're trying to push the envelope here and trying to make people think critically about stuff. I'm just kidding. But I do sometimes have opinions that aren't shared by everyone. But I'm going to go ahead and play the hits. We're playing the classics. No deep tracks today. This is our #1 radio single right here. FIFA sucks, right? FIFA's corrupt. And here's the latest proof of that. So the 2034 World Cup, if you are unfamiliar with the bidding process, is one of the most hilariously thumb on the scale distorted bidding process that you could possibly have. Okay. The reason this is in the news today is because Saudi Arabia has officially launched its bid for the World Cup in 2034. And if you're thinking, well, I mean, didn't they technically already host a World Cup when it was in like Qatar, which is, closer to Saudi Arabia than where I grew up is to any other state in the United States, right? Like Florida's a long state. Qatar is, tinier than it took me 5 hours to drive to Georgia. It takes you about 45 minutes to drive from Doha to Saudi Arabia. At most an hour and a half with traffic. Yeah, about an hour 19 right now. But it doesn't look like there's a lot of traffic, so I might have unrounded that pretty significantly. But the Doha, to be fair, is all the way on the far side of the country. So it's one of the longer drives you're going to be doing. Now, if I'm driving from Abu Samra to Salwa, it's like a pretty short drive. I can walk that. 26-minute drive, but it cannot calculate my walking distance. What is Google good for again? Well, we're playing the hits, and that's because Saudi Arabia's bid that was formally introduced in the last day or two is entirely uncontested. And if you're thinking, wow, that's a little suspicious, your spidey senses are right on that one. You don't get to be in the next Avengers because I don't know if Spider-Man is in those, but you are at least on the right track because the way that Gianni Infantino has set this up, Saudi Arabia is essentially the only option from the beginning. And to understand why, you have to go back to the 2026 World Cup, which, if you don't know, the next World Cup is going to be in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. But the most important point is it is going to be a CONCACAF World Cup. That is the federation that has to do with Central America, the Caribbean, North America, which is U.S., Canada, and Greenland sometimes when we get really into looking at tectonic plates. But that removes CONCACAF from being able to host the World Cup for the next 2 cycles. That's a FIFA rule, right? It's a FIFA rule that they could change, but they don't want to, and we're getting to why. Right, so they have a World Cup in CONCACAF, which is in 2026, removes CONCACAF from the 2030 and 2034 cycle, which is fair. That's not weird. You got to host the World Cup somewhere. So Asia can't have a World Cup in 2026 or 2030 because, it was just in Asia in 2022. We will come back to that, put a little, fucking dog ear that little note because we're going to come back to it. Then in 2030, right, that whole process was set to be announced in 2024. Who was going to be hosting the World Cup in 2030? And there was a very strong bid, made even stronger by Morocco's performance at the 2022 World Cup, that involved Morocco, Spain, and Portugal, all right next to each other. If you don't know where Morocco is, just think Spain, and the first point in Africa you can get to out of that is Morocco. So they're all right next to each other. It's a bid that makes complete sense. It also involves 2 continents. And that is interesting because to my knowledge, has never happened before when it comes to World Cups. Not that it would be weird. I mean, we've had multi-country World Cups. We did Japan, South Korea in 2002, right? They're way farther away from each other than Spain, Portugal, and Morocco are. So it just happens to be on 2 different continents. So that is a different experience for the rule in 2030, but that was a brilliant bid, right? Spain, Portugal, Morocco getting to play World Cup home matches at the same time, involving 2 continents with Africa's first ever team to make it to a semifinal of a World Cup. Just sounds like a great time. But then FIFA made a really weird decision because there was another bid for this World Cup. Because if you didn't know, the 2030 World Cup is actually the 100th anniversary of the first World Cup, which was in Uruguay, right? Like they hosted in Uruguay and South America. And so South America put together an albeit troubled bid to run against Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, right? They put together, it was a 4-country bid, involved like Paraguay, Uruguay. It was very interesting bid that I've read some articles about it back when it came out. It wasn't super cohesive. It wasn't as good of a proposal. Spain, Portugal, Morocco was the clear favorite, and Spain, Portugal, Morocco was awarded the World Cup by FIFA. And it's at that point that Gianni Infantino absolutely sent it. And this has been coming for a long time, right? Because Gianni Infantino, as this article by the New York Times, sorry, let me scroll up this article. If you want to learn every little detail about this, you read this article, right, on the New York Times. I've read a bunch of articles about this. They did the best job. I feel so edified reading about it. But there are two things that Gianni Infantino did that made it very obvious what he wanted to happen and essentially rigged the system for Saudi Arabia to win. Now, why would Gianni Infantino want Saudi Arabia to win? Well, the same reason that, like, everybody else does stuff with Saudi Arabia. It's money. Like it's very clearly money. And in this New York Times article does a very good job of detailing the fact that it is money that's the reason that he's doing this. He's been involved with Saudi Arabia for a long time because he wants to do stuff, and doing stuff requires money, and Saudi Arabia has essentially an unlimited supply of that. In 2018, Mr. Infantino stunned members of FIFA's board by demanding permission to close a new deal for competitions with investors whose identity he refused to reveal. I'll give you one guess who those investors were. It eventually emerged that Saudi Arabia was one of the biggest backers of the investor in that project. Then the Saudi Arabia backed an idea to hold World Cups every 2 years so that it could get a World Cup earlier. Essentially, that was why they wanted to do it. And Gianni Infantino, if you remember, kind of enthusiastically embraced the idea of, hey, maybe we want to do a World Cup every 2 years. Furious response, and then it went away. Despite those failures, he continued to just kind of have a really unusually cozy relationship. It is not unusual for Gianni Infantino to meet with world leaders, right? Everybody that's ever been president of FIFA enjoys being wined and dined. They'd like show up at the UN for some reason. They're very influential, essentially because they have one of the greatest magic wands in the world that they can just bless a country with a World Cup, right? And they also can direct funding from FIFA. But when you can bless a country with the World Cup, you hold immense geopolitical power. So it's not unusual that he meets with leaders all the time. This article in particular details him talking to the leader of Italy for a reason that, remember, we dog-eared something earlier? We're still going to come back to that later. But he did star in a video released by the Ministry of Sports of Saudi Arabia. This is that video. And at exactly 17 seconds, we see masked up Gianni Infantino in the video. This is 17 seconds into a 3.5-minute promotional video for like Saudi sports. So he's making cameos here. I mean, he's making cameos for Saudi Arabia. And they also point out that he was in a box, but like honestly, FIFA leaders are all like in boxes with everybody all the time. That to me is not as particularly wild, right? I don't think that needs to be blown like all out of proportion. I do think the other stuff is a very clear sign that he wants to work closely with Saudi Arabia. He wants the money either for himself or for FIFA projects or whatever he wants to work on to try and build some sort of legacy. He sees Saudi Arabia as a way to acquire that. Maybe he wants part of his legacy to be kind of incorporating the power of Saudi Arabia within the FIFA umbrella and making Saudi Arabia a valuable FIFA ally. But this is the background for what he's about to do and what he did less than a year ago. Okay, because these are the two things. One, the 2030 World Cup, FIFA, in an unprecedented move, right, in a really wild, out of left field move, decided to combine the proposals for the World Cup. So remember how we had Spain, Portugal, Morocco? Well, FIFA went into its bag and decided to combine that with the one from South America. And you might be starting to figure out what's going on here. there would be just one match played in Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay. Just one. The first 3 matches of the World Cup. Right here. First 3 games. Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay. They just get to host the first 3 matches as a celebration of the 100th anniversary, which is a very flimsy layer of paper that you can just kind of, when it blows away, you go, wait a second. That means the World Cup's in 3 continents. That means the World Cup is in Europe, Africa, and South America. It ain't that sneaky because it was also just in CONCACAF, which means the only continents that can host a World Cup in 2034. Ding, 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 ding. Oh, it's Asia and Oceania, but I don't think Fiji's hosting a World Cup anytime soon. That would be sick, but I don't think they can. Right, let's get Roy Krishna out there. He plays until he's 45. That'd be awesome. I'd back that bid, but it's Asia and Oceania. The issue is, Asia, there are places that can host a World Cup in Asia. Right? China comes to mind. Australia just hosted the Women's World Cup combined with New Zealand. They might be able to put together a pretty good bid, even though you have excluded the vast majority of the world, right? You've excluded the only continents that have ever won a World Cup, which always creates a really attractive proposal to be able to host a World Cup. You've excluded all of that. You're still dealing with potentially some nations that might try. It's a little early for South Korea and Japan to try and get involved again, but still, like a China and Australia, New Zealand, there is a chance. So there had to be a second weird thing that FIFA was going to do. And that second weird thing that they did was they moved up. And then when you think about the logistical effort that a World Cup is, then you the more you think about, especially a 48-team World Cup, you got to have accommodations. You have to have everything that meets FIFA standards. You have to have practice fields. You have to have public transportation. You have to have security. You have to have the stadium plans in place or the stadium's already there, right? This is one of the largest logistical operations that occurs on the planet. Right, it is the World Cup. There are millions of people involved, billions of dollars, and the thing that FIFA did was they moved up the deadline to submit your interest in hosting the 2034 World Cup, right? Because not only did they just ban, not flagrantly ban them, but like via the rules, they like hit them with the rule book, they banned 4 continents from being able to host the World Cup in 2034, they also moved up the deadline to submit your interest. And they moved up this process by 3 years. From the announcement, which was like the same time that they were announcing who was hosting the 2030 World Cup, you just kind of sneak it in under the radar, they said you had 25 days to register your interest. Now, this takes serious government backing. Like, say Australia and New Zealand want to host this. You have to go through a bunch of government terminals to secure funding and to you get this approved by all the different municipalities that are going to be hosting it. But when your country is a kingdom, it's a little easier to do that. Or when you already know that that's going to happen. Because less than an hour after that announcement was made, there was one country that submitted its proposal and registered its interest. Less than an hour. Saudi Arabia. Obviously, it was Saudi Arabia. Less than an hour. They didn't even try to hide it. They were like, finally, Johnny, we'd been talking about this for years. Seriously, Gianni Infantino. Seriously. And this was their backup plan. Right? They put the proposal in. You would add basically a couple of weeks to put all of this together. And then you had to put in your initial interest. And then obviously Saudi Arabia's lunch proposal. But they're only doing that for lip service and like eye candy, right? They're already going to get the World Cup. Nobody else registered it. Australia and New Zealand were, they were interested, but there was no way they were going to be able to get the proposal together. And it was also clear, how are you going to beat, all of these different visual appearances and teamwork between Infantino and Saudi Arabia? Some of the stuff that was coming out of Australia and New Zealand is like, well, why would we go for it? We know we're not going to win. Like, there's no way we're going to win. And so Saudi Arabia is the only bid, and then Infantino can turn around and be like, well, we only got one bid. I have to give it to Saudi Arabia. Sorry, losers. Like, it's just very obvious And I know they said we were moving into a new era of FIFA, and they were right. Right? They were moving into a new era of FIFA. But they're doing the same thing. They're just doing it a different way. So the Qatar one, they got bribed and then pretended to hold like a sham vote. And for this one, they didn't even do with the vote. They just, played the rules game and put Saudi Arabia in position. But there's one more thing that makes it even more painful. And it's the thing I was teasing earlier, which is the two World Cup rule, it doesn't apply to Saudi Arabia because Gianni Infantino, remember I said he's had meetings with the Italian minister and that happened in this article? Well, check this out. Initially, Saudi Arabia was trying to get involved in a bid for 2030, which of course would have violated the rule. But Gianni Infantino didn't seem to have any issue with an Asian nation hosting after, an Asian nation hosted just 2 World Cups ago, because he went to Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, or he went to Egypt, they said yes. So Saudi Arabia and Egypt were teamed up, and he went to Italy and he said, Italy could be a partner in Europe to try host the World Cup. So then you sell it like, well, we're having it in 2 continents that are okay, in 1 continent that, whatever. So it would have been Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Italy. And then Italy said no because of political tensions with Egypt. And then he went to Greece. He went to Greece and was like, in 2030, what if it was Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Greece? And then Greece also said no, they weren't going to be able to get involved with it. But Gianni Infantino is perfectly happy to bend the rules for Saudi Arabia so that they could host a World Cup in 2030. But now that we're in 2034, he is using those very same rules to make sure that nobody else is able to bid on the 2030 for a World Cup and keep everybody else tied up with, the fact that 3 continents are hosting the World Cup in 2030. And then, moving forward a process that was supposed to happen 3 years later and allowing 25 days to get your initial interest registered and your proposal in. It's a clown show. Like if you actually just look, it's like raising the hood on a car. If you just raise the hood on the car, you don't even have to know what all of the things in there are. Right? I don't have to know what councils this passed through, although I know that it was a small group of executives that made these decisions. And then there's kind of like a rubber stamp board that they can kind of load with whoever they want on it that just kind of stamps off on the decision. So I did read enough to know that, but you just lift up the hood of the car and there's just no engine there. You're just like, what is going on? It's so obvious what happened. It's almost laughable. It's definitely sad. The World Cup is going to be in Saudi Arabia in 2034, which I'm sure they're going to blow $80 billion on making it a sick World Cup, but it's an open process that should be open. And I feel like it very rarely has been open or not rigged in some way in a long time. And maybe it's wishful thinking, but hopefully at some point in my lifetime, there will be a World Cup that is selected just entirely fairly again, once, ever. Who am I kidding? Back to playing video games. Bye, guys.